She spat in the food during a pandemic, and somehow I was the problem? It was one of those moments where you freeze, not because you don't know what's wrong, but because you know exactly what's wrong. You expect someone, anyone, to step in. Instead, they look away, pretend it didn't happen. And when you finally speak up, they don't call you brave. They call you a snitch. This isn't just a story about bad behavior in a kitchen. It's about what happens when doing the right thing makes you the enemy. When silence is loyalty and truth is betrayal. It's about the dark side of restaurant culture, where team player sometimes means look the other way. And where whistleblowers don't get medals, they get cold shoulders and worse shifts. In this video, we'll break it all down. We'll talk about what really happened the night someone spit in a customer's food, and why calling it out led to everyone else turning their backs. We'll explore the legal and moral gray areas of being a whistleblower. We'll hear from guests who've worked behind the scenes of big-name chains and seen things they still can't unsee. We'll ask what you would do in the same situation, and whether silence is safer or just easier. And we'll talk about how management, fear, and peer pressure can turn restaurants into ethical minefields. By the end, you might rethink the difference between loyalty and complicity. Everyone has that one story, the one they still think about at 2 a.m., wondering if they should have spoken up. If you've lived it, we want to hear it. Share your story anonymously through the pinned link in the comments. For every 1,000 views, we'll donate $1 to support people facing hardship after doing the right thing. Because your truth might be the courage someone else needs today.
It was just another Saturday night rush. The kind of shift where your shoes stick to the floor, your manager's yelling into a headset, and every customer thinks their burger deserves a Nobel Prize. In other words, a normal weekend in food service. I was working the expo line, wiping plates, double-checking ticket times, when I heard a laugh that didn't sound right. Not the tired, shared laugh between coworkers. It was mean, sharp, the kind of laugh that follows something you're not supposed to do. I turned just in time to see her lean over a plate, some guy's chicken parmesan, and spit in it. No hesitation, just spit. She spat on the food during a pandemic. Those were the only words I could get out later when I tried to explain it to my manager, because I couldn't believe it either. Was the customer rude? Absolutely. He snapped at her, called her sweetheart, complained about the wait, but spitting in his food wasn't justice. It was a biohazard. I remember staring at the plate, thinking, that's not a mistake. That's a decision. And here's where it gets weird. No one else seemed shocked. They just looked away. One coworker rolled his eyes and said, "Don't get involved, man. She's just blowing off steam." Another shrugged, better than throwing it at him. I kept waiting for someone to say, "Hey, that's not okay." But that moment never came. Instead, I was the one who spoke up. And just like that, the room got colder. It wasn't the act that shocked me most. It was how fast everyone chose silence. I thought I was doing the right thing. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just didn't want a guy, rude or not, eating someone else's spit. But the reaction I got made me wonder if I'd broken some invisible rule. Not the health code, the kitchen code. That night, I learned something I wish I hadn't. There are rules in restaurants that aren't posted on the wall. And if you break them, even for the right reasons, you don't get applause. You get iced out.
When I told my manager what happened, I thought I was doing the right thing. Turns out, that depends on who you ask. Because the next day, no one said thank you. No one said good call. What I got instead was a whisper behind my back. He's a snitch. That word carries weight, especially in a workplace like a restaurant where everything runs on unspoken rules and shifting loyalties. Being labeled a snitch doesn't mean you lied. It just means you told the truth out loud. So let's pause here. What's the difference between a snitch and a whistleblower? Legally speaking, a whistleblower is someone who reports illegal or unethical behavior, especially when it puts others at risk. They're protected by law in many places, especially if the act they report involves public safety, fraud, or harassment. Ethically speaking, whistleblowers are the people who raise their hands when it would be easier to look away. They're the ones who say, "This is wrong," even if it costs them something. But in the court of workplace gossip, there's no trial, just judgment. In corporate settings, people file formal reports about embezzlement, fake invoices, or time card fraud. That's considered brave. But in a restaurant, you say someone spit in a customer's meal, and you're the bad guy. Why? Because there's this idea, especially in high-stress environments like kitchens, that loyalty means silence. That calling out a coworker breaks the bond that keeps the place from falling apart, even when the thing they did could get someone seriously hurt. Here's the irony. If I'd worked in an office and exposed someone for stealing company money, I'd probably get promoted. But because I exposed someone for contaminating food, actual food that people eat, I got ignored on the shift schedule for 3 days straight. What does that tell us? That sometimes the environment you work in shapes how morality is defined. In some places, speaking up is seen as strength. In others, it's betrayal. But what if staying silent is the bigger betrayal? What if protecting someone's ego means endangering someone else's health? That's the question that stayed with me. Not, was I right? But, why did it feel so wrong to be right?
I get it. Restaurants are chaotic. You're on your feet for 10 hours, the fryer's screaming, the line's backed up, and someone just sent back their burger because the pickle touched the bun. You joke, you vent, you survive. But there's a difference between blowing off steam and blowing spit onto someone's dinner. And here's the part that made my stomach turn. This wasn't just some gross moment. It was a health violation, a full-blown biohazard. I brought in someone who spent over a decade behind the kitchen door, Marcus, a former executive chef turned food safety consultant. This man's seen more in a walk-in freezer than most of us have in our entire careers. And when I asked him about what happened, he didn't laugh, he didn't shrug, he said 5 words. That could shut a place down. According to Marcus, spitting in food, pandemic or not, crosses every line. Not just ethically, but legally. Most health departments classify bodily fluids in food prep as a critical violation. That's not a write-up, that's a close the restaurant kind of offense. He told me that even before COVID, restaurants were supposed to treat food contact surfaces like medical instruments. Because, in a way, they are. People trust you, not just with their hunger, but their health. One incident like this? That's how people get E. coli, hepatitis, norovirus. And during a global health crisis, it's not just disgusting, it's reckless. And yet, Marcus said he wasn't surprised. He's seen it all. Line cooks reusing gloves after touching raw chicken, servers picking fries off plates and putting them back, one guy who regularly stirred sauces with his fingers to check the temperature. Why? Because some kitchens don't just cut corners, they normalize cutting corners. And that's the scariest part. It's not the one person who breaks the rule, it's the whole culture that quietly lets it slide. Marcus put it best. In kitchens where bad habits are ignored, the line between frustrated and unsafe disappears fast. So yeah, it wasn't just spit. It was a wake-up call. And I'm still wondering why I was the only one who heard it.
I thought the hard part was over once I told the manager. I imagined a quiet thank you, maybe even a team meeting about hygiene, professionalism, basic human decency. Instead, the silence got louder. My name disappeared from the better shifts. Break room conversations paused when I walked in. People didn't yell, they didn't confront me, they just stopped seeing me. That's when I realized I hadn't just reported a health violation, I'd broken a bigger rule, The rule of silence. Every workplace has it, that invisible agreement. We don't talk about what happens behind the curtain. In restaurants, it's even stronger because survival depends on speed, on covering each other, on letting things slide just this once. And when you speak up, you're not just a problem, you're a disruption. I became the one who turned on the team, not the one who stood up for the customer, not the one who tried to keep everyone safe, just the one who made it awkward. It didn't matter that I was right. What mattered was that I said it out loud. So I talked to a behavioral psychologist, someone who studies group dynamics in high-pressure jobs, and she explained something I'll never forget. When you speak truth into a system built on denial, you don't just challenge the act, you challenge everyone who stayed silent. That hit hard. Because suddenly, I wasn't just pointing out one wrong, I was holding up a mirror, and no one wants to be in the reflection. She told me about the concept of group cohesion, the idea that people will protect the group, even if it means punishing someone who's right, just to keep the illusion of unity. And in kitchens, that cohesion runs deep. You bleed together, laugh together, endure unreasonable lunch rushes together. It builds a bond. But that bond, it's fragile, and sometimes it's held together with duct tape and denial. So the person who breaks the silence, even with good intentions, becomes the threat. Not because they did something wrong, but because they reminded everyone else they didn't do anything at all. It's wild, isn't it? You do what you were raised to believe is right, tell the truth, protect others, and suddenly, you're the one eating lunch alone.
After that whole mess with the spit, I did what anyone with unresolved trauma and an internet connection would do. I went to Reddit. I typed in, "worst thing you've seen working in a chain restaurant," and wow, I wasn't ready. Let me read you a few. We've verified these are public stories shared under fair use for commentary, because journalism, baby. First up, Olive Garden, 2017. A server dropped a lasagna face down in the back hallway. Kitchen said, "just flip it, extra cheese on top." Another one. Worked at Chili's. Manager told us not to toss out expired sauce packets. They're sealed, they're fine. Some were turning colors I didn't know sauces could turn. And one that made me question everything. I worked at a famous sandwich chain. We weren't allowed to throw away anything unless it smelled rotten. Mold? Just scrape it. Let me be clear, this isn't about shaming brands. It's about culture. When you're moving that fast, with margins that thin, and a staff that's barely paid enough to breathe, corners get cut. And sometimes, those corners end up in someone's soup. I asked a friend who used to manage at a national diner chain how common that stuff is. She said, "Oh, you mean the time our cook used a mop bucket to thaw frozen fries?" Then she paused. That wasn't even the worst of it. She didn't tell me what was. I didn't ask. But here's the thing. These aren't just horror stories to pass around for shock value. They're symptoms of a deeper problem. Burnout, underfunding, and a total lack of accountability. When the pace is punishing and the pressure's high, safety becomes optional. And people learn fast. If you speak up, you might be next. So instead of changing the system, they just learn to live with the rot. But once you see it, once you really see how normalized these shortcuts are, you can't unsee it. You start to wonder, how many good meals were built on bad habits? Let's play it out. Same restaurant, same shift. Same moment when you see someone lean over a plate and do the unthinkable. Now imagine two versions of you. Same uniform, same sweaty apron, different choices. Version 1. You stay silent. You pretend you didn't see it. You tell yourself it's just one plate. You keep wiping down the counter like your conscience isn't whispering in your ear. Nobody gives you the cold shoulder. You still get invited to staff drinks after work. You survive the night. But that customer? They eat it.
And the next day, they call back, sick. You hear your coworker laugh in the break room. Must have been the undercooked shrimp, they say. But you know better. And the worst part? Now you're part of the lie. Version 2, you speak up. You go to the manager, you lay it out. Your hands are shaking, not because you're scared of what you saw, but because you know what's about to happen. You're not fired, not officially, but your schedule shrinks. Your coworkers look through you like you don't exist. One of them tells you, "We don't rat around here." You go home wondering if you did the right thing, because it sure doesn't feel like it. So, what's the better outcome? Depends on what you're trying to protect. Your peace, your paycheck, or your principles. Here's the thing they don't teach you in training. The real job isn't just about carrying trays or memorizing table numbers. It's about knowing when to carry the weight of doing what's right, even if no one claps for it. And that's the trap. Most of us don't freeze because we don't care. We freeze because we're afraid to be alone in our caring. But what if you're not alone?
You'd think the manager would have your back. After all, you didn't lie. You didn't exaggerate. You literally watched someone spit in a customer's food. So when you reported it, you expected, bare minimum, a conversation. Maybe a policy reminder. Maybe even a, "Hey, that's not how we do things here." Instead, you got this. Just let it go. Let it go? She contaminated someone's dinner during a public health crisis, and somehow I was the disruption? That's when I learned what it means to have management that folds under pressure. Not because they're bad people, but because they're afraid of rocking the boat. Because keeping the peace is easier than doing the right thing. I once asked a former GM at a well-known casual dining chain how she would have handled it. She said, "It depends. Are we short-staffed?" That answer says everything. Because in too many workplaces, leadership becomes logistics. It's not about ethics. It's about schedules, coverage, and who's least likely to walk out mid-shift. And when leadership is driven by fear of conflict, of losing staff, of messing up metrics, it stops being leadership at all. It becomes damage control. And anyone who speaks up becomes the damage. So who should they protect? The staff? The customer? The brand? Here's the truth. A real leader protects the standard. They protect the culture they claim to stand for. And when someone violates it, whether they're your top server or your cousin's boyfriend, you act. Not to punish, but to preserve integrity. Because every time you ignore something just this once, you're teaching everyone else what's really allowed. You can't build a respectful team in a place where the rules only apply until they're inconvenient. So yes, management had a choice. They could have pulled her aside. They could have said, "You're done here." Or even just, "That's not okay." Instead, they said nothing. And their silence said everything. Let's be honest. It's easy to say, "I would have spoken up," when you're watching from a screen, sipping iced coffee on your couch. But when you're in it, on the floor, in uniform, side eyes all around, it's not just a question of right or wrong. It's a question of risk. So we asked a few people who've lived that life. Service workers, managers, kitchen staff, from fast food to fine dining, and gave them a simple prompt. You see a coworker spit in a customer's food. What do you do? Guest 1. Jordan, former barista, now high school teacher. I'd speak up, every time. If I stayed quiet, I'd carry that with me longer than I'd carry a paycheck. I don't want to be complicit in someone else's humiliation. Guest 2. Mari, line cook, 12 years in the industry. Honestly, I'd think twice. Not because it's okay, but because I've seen what happens to people who break the code. I've had rent to pay. I've had shifts taken for less. Guest 3. Kenji, assistant manager at a casual dining chain. I'd report it, but I'd do it quietly.
I document, send it up the chain, because sometimes the system punishes loud truth but protects quiet paperwork. And now it's your turn. If you were in that kitchen, saw what I saw, what would you do? Would you speak up, knowing it could isolate you? Or stay silent, hoping someone else would handle it? Because in real life, that moment passes fast, and all you've got is your gut, your values, and about 2 seconds to decide. Poll question for viewers. If you saw someone tamper with a customer's food, would you report it? A. Yes, always. B. It depends on the situation. C. No, not my business. Tell us why in the comments. We'll feature the most insightful responses in a future video.
We've walked through a lot tonight. A kitchen where someone crossed the line. A manager who stayed silent. A team that chose comfort over accountability. And a decision that should have been simple, but wasn't. We saw how telling the truth can cost you friends, shifts, even your sense of belonging. And how keeping quiet, just for the sake of keeping peace, can cost someone else their safety. We heard from people who've lived this story before. People who spoke up and paid the price. People who didn't and never forgot it. So here's the truth that stayed with me. Silence in the face of contamination is complicity. Not just in restaurants. In any room where something wrong happens and no one says a word. Because silence protects the problem, and the problem grows stronger every time it goes unchallenged. It's not easy to be the one who raises their hand, but it's harder to be the person who looks back and wonders if they should have. If this story made you think, if it reminded you of a moment you stayed quiet, or a time you found the courage to speak, then it wasn't just a story. It was something bigger, something we're still writing together. We want to hear your story. What's the dirtiest, most unbelievable thing you've seen happen in a restaurant? Share it anonymously through the pinned link in the comments. We'll feature selected stories in a future episode. For every 1,000 views this video gets, we'll donate $1 to organizations that support workers who speak up when it matters most. Because telling the truth shouldn't come at the cost of your dignity. And if your story can help someone else find their voice, it deserves to be heard. Stick around. We've got more stories coming, more silence to break, and more tables to clean, this time for good.